Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. When news first spread that a grocer from the Pimlico neighborhood of central London had died, few people outside of his family took notice. The crowds that would later gather for the sensational trial were nowhere to be seen at the start of his death inquest on January 7, 1886. A few reporters were there just to babysit the proceedings, as was the practice of the time when an unnatural death was under investigation. But straight away, it became clear that the death of Edwin Bartlett was one of the most scintillating and strange Pimlico would ever see. The first witness at the inquest was the dead man's bereaved father, who launched into an attack against Edwin's wife, Adelaide. The elder Bartlett complained that in Edwin's final weeks alive, Adelaide didn't let him visit with his son as he grappled with an inexplicable illness that seemed to emanate from his mouth. He'd gone to the dentist for one extraction after another to rid his mouth of rotted teeth. His gums were literally covered in fungus. Doctors spoke ominously of necrosis. Adelaide had served as a sort of gatekeeper for her husband, insisting he needed as much rest as possible, which, in fairness, was true. His body was waging a mighty battle against itself throughout much of December 1885, but as the month neared a close, it seemed Adelaide's prescriptions were paying off. Edwin was feeling better. The agoraphobia that had gripped him during the peak of his illness was subsiding, his mood was improving, and by December 31st, he was even talking about returning to work. It was quite the shock then when, early New Year's Day, Adelaide rushed through her rental home and screamed the awful words, "I think Mr. Bartlett is dead." Her landlords, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Doggett, rushed to the Bartlett's flat and found Edwin in a cot near the still blazing fireplace. He was cold to the touch. A strange odor permeated the room, a tangy chemical smell. But Edwin had been on so many medications and undergone so many foul treatments, the off-putting scent didn't raise eyebrows, at least not initially. Adelaide was visibly bereft. Everyone who'd been in Edwin's sick room over the past few weeks had seen how she doted on him, giving him his medicine and arranging doctor and dental visits to an almost extreme degree. In fact, one of the doctors actually had to say, "No, Edwin's getting better. I don't need to come so often." And Adelaide objected. She had been strict, too, about who was allowed to see her husband as he lay ill. This had infuriated Edwin's father, but the tactics seemed to be working. After all, Edwin had really improved in his final week alive. He was quite a few teeth short of where he'd started, but he felt energetic again. He was able to eat. Things had been looking up. Then, suddenly, he was gone. Adelaide was soon comforted by the Reverend George Dyson, a close friend of the Bartletts, as Edwin's doctors, friends, and family began inspecting the room in which he died, trying to piece together what could have possibly killed the man. Someone noticed that chemical odor again and said, "It kind of smells like chloroform." Reverend Dyson felt his stomach drop as he frantically began to wonder, had he unwittingly helped his lover murder his best friend? Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Quin, I just got back from a 2-week vacation, a big chunk of which was spent in California, and it was tough to pack for because first I was going to San Francisco where it was like 60 degrees, and then I was traveling south to LA where it was 95 degrees. One of the no-brainer outfits I chose, though, was from Quin. It was a pretty blue, long-sleeve but lightweight dress that worked in both climates. Quin has become my go-to for high-quality vacation essentials I'll be packing for trips to come. They've got premium European linen dresses, blouses, and shorts from $30, washable silk tops, premium luggage options, and so much more. The best part, all Quin's items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They do this by partnering directly with top factories. That way, Quin's cuts out the cost of the middleman and passes the savings on to us. And this is important to me, Quin's only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. I love that. I also love the linen coat that I got for Scott. It's really nice. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials from Quin's. Go to quince.com/COTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/COTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/COTC. In 1853, a young English woman named Clara Chamberlain was wed to a widower more than 15 years her senior. His name was Adolphe Collet de la Tremoille, and he came from illustrious French stock. He not only held the title Count of Escurey, but he also was a descendant of Georges de la Tremoille, a favorite of Charles VII of France, and supposed archenemy of Joan of Arc. I couldn't let this tidbit go without doing a little extra research, of course, and let's just say that Georges didn't seem to be the most stand-up of fellows. He actually became one of the king's favorites by killing another one of the king's favorites and then marrying that guy's wife. Anyway, Clara Chamberlain and Adolphe Collet de la Tremoille got married and had a son a year later in England. The couple welcomed a daughter named Adelaide the following year, in 1855, after the family moved to France. But there's an asterisk next to that seemingly banal fact. While Adolphe's name appears on Adelaide's French birth certificate, it's widely accepted he was not her biological father. This will come into major play later. Regardless, Adelaide's parents welcomed another son and a daughter in 1858 and 1860, respectively, and lived unremarkable lives for the most part. In 1866, by which time Adolphe had already died, Clara passed away too, at only 33 years old. She'd been living in London with her 4 children and her 17-year-old sister Ellen, who earned a modest living teaching French. After Clara's death, the family was split up. We only know that the youngest daughter, named Clara after her mother, was sent to her maternal aunt and uncle's home where she died in 1873 at just 13 years old. What happened to Adelaide and her brothers in this time period isn't totally clear. A census in 1871 England lists Adelaide living with her younger brother Freddie in the home of William and Anne Wellbeloved. Though author Kate Clark, who wrote a book about this case, suggests that Adelaide might have been sent to a convent to study. It's possible both things are true. What we do know is that in 1875, when she was 19 years old, Adelaide moved to England and lodged in the home of a man named Charles Bartlett, and it was through him that she met his brother, Edwin. Edwin was 30 at this time, so 11 years Adelaide's senior, and he was smitten with her straight away. She was an attractive, dark-haired, bilingual Anglo-French beauty, for starters, and she was also well-educated and poised, traits that Edwin found alluring. Edwin, meanwhile, was an attractive suitor. The son of a cabinet maker, after whom he was named, Edwin had opened a handful of successful grocery stores and was considered a hard-working, industrious type. It didn't hurt that he was good-looking, too, with fair hair and blue eyes. People described him as looking younger than his age, with a healthy beard and a compassionate side. One of his doctors would later relay that Edwin kept a jar in his office to collect money for the poor. Now, it wasn't love at first sight between Edwin and Adelaide, which I'll explain later. But things moved quickly from there, according to a very serious-sounding Mark John McGuire from They Got Away with Murder.
And they were married in Croydon soon afterwards.
I found that marriage certificate, which noted Edwin's real first name was Thomas, though no one ever called him that. The document also identified Adelaide's deceased legal father as a professor of mathematics, which I thought was interesting because I couldn't find that mentioned anywhere else. What happened after that April 1875 wedding was not exactly typical for a newlywed couple. Instead of, say, moving in together, Edwin sent Adelaide to another convent for more studies. Clark explained in her book that this had to do with Edwin's business dealings. He had partnered with someone who didn't want Edwin getting married straight away for fear it would pull his attention away from the grocery stores they were running, so Edwin kept the marriage a secret for a while. It wasn't until 1877, so 2 years after the marriage, that the two actually lived as a couple.
In 1877, Adelaide and Edwin moved into rooms above Baxter and Bartlett in Station Road, Ernhill. But Adelaide was restless, and she had a wandering eye, all qualities apparent in her father, whose looks she seemed to have inherited too. She announced to her husband that she was going to stay with an aunt for a week, and soon after her return, she announced another week's stay with her aunt.
This was okay by Edwin, in part because his mother was dying at the time, but also because it just seemed that living as husband and wife wasn't a priority for either of the pair. That's not to say they were cold or distant. In fact, they were quite loving toward each other. But their union was never the fiery, passionate type. After Edwin's mother died and Adelaide decided to stay in their flat for a bit, Edwin's father moved in. Talking about him becomes a little difficult in the narration because his name was also Edwin, and while I would just call him Mr. Bartlett to avoid confusion, sometimes Adelaide called her husband Mr. Bartlett, so that doesn't help. We'll call the elder Edwin Father Bartlett to keep things clear. Father Bartlett and Adelaide didn't really get along from the get-go. It's possible that had to do with Adelaide's origins because he definitely knew that her legal father, the man listed on her birth certificate, was not her biological father. He knew this because Edwin and Adelaide's marriage hadn't been the fall-in-love, let's-get-hitched type. It had been an arrangement with a contract drawn up between Edwin's lawyer and Adelaide's real father's agents. The contract had 3 stipulations: that Edwin should take sole responsibility for Adelaide after their marriage, that he should continue her education, and that he should never refer to her origins. That Adelaide was technically a bastard child would have been quite the scandal in Victorian-era England, of course, so maybe that's what Father Bartlett had against her. But it's also fair to think that he might have had a gut feeling about Adelaide that, frankly, bore out. Soon after he moved in with Edwin and Adelaide, the missus vanished.
Father and son set about looking for her. It was coincidentally discovered that Edwin's younger brother, Frederick, was also missing, and had been missing on both occasions on which Adelaide had been visiting her aunt. The sudden realization that Frederick and Adelaide had been involved in an affair stunned the family.
Edwin was either in complete denial about this or he didn't much care, which typically would seem unfathomable for a husband faced with evidence his wife is sleeping with his brother. But Edwin and Adelaide's relationship had already been an odd one, so who knows? From Well I Never.
Because Edwin Jr. worked long hours, she was often alone. Perhaps the young woman sought unorthodox companionship from her husband's sibling. Whether or not the accusations were true, Adelaide denied them, and Edwin believed his wife.
Now, Father Bartlett was another story. He believed Adelaide and Frederick were shacking up, and he began bad-mouthing Adelaide. This did not go over well.
The couple even forced Edwin Sr. to sign a written apology, while Frederick, interestingly, moved to the United States.
Father Bartlett would later say he didn't believe a word of the apology he wrote and signed, but he did it to keep the peace. It worked enough to keep Edwin and his daughter-in-law in his life, but not enough to keep his place in their home. Adelaide convinced Edwin to move to a different flat above one of his stores, and it so happened that this new flat didn't have space for her father-in-law. Shucks, geez, isn't that a shame? So Father Bartlett lived alone, which was tough for him as a widower, especially one who had been so close with the son who shared his name. Now, the climax of all this family drama was in 1877, and for a few years afterward, things seemed to calm down. Adelaide was happier with her father-in-law out of her house, and she and Edwin consummated their marriage. In fact, Adelaide got pregnant. The couple were thrilled, but, as a documentary by Briefcase explained,
the pregnancy was proving to be difficult.
Infant mortality rates were, of course, terrifying back in this era, so any hiccups during pregnancy were cause for concern. Because the Bartletts had the means, they were able to hire a midwife to monitor things.
Edwin arranged for a nurse named Annie Walker to move into their apartment and help look after his wife. Nurse Walker recommended that a doctor be present to assist with the birth, but Edwin objected.
Edwin wasn't exactly a fan of doctors or dentists. He would eventually welcome both into his home as his life hung in the balance, but not at this point, when only Adelaide and his baby were at stake. It's hard to know if the baby would have survived the difficult labor had a doctor been on site. Instead, she was stillborn, and Adelaide was devastated, both emotionally and physically. She vowed to never have another child. She told Annie Walker this, who stayed 3 weeks after the tragic delivery to help Adelaide recuperate. Meanwhile, Edwin's grocery businesses continued to prosper. He and his business partner, Edward Baxter, opened a new store with every passing year, each emblazoned with the names Baxter and Bartlett in bold letters facing the street. They sold all kinds of provisions, including teas, quote, individually blended for the more discerning customer, a wide selection of wines and cheeses, fresh butter from local farms, fancy cakes, and assortment sweetmeats, end quote. That's from Clark's book. The shops did well enough that Edwin and Adelaide could employ and house servants. Ironically, in the flat they said was too small to share with Father Bartlett. Meanwhile, Adelaide was constantly bored. She had no household responsibilities, and she wasn't allowed to get a job. She also had no outside friends. Whether that was due to her aloof nature or something else, she just didn't seem to gel with other women she met, and because of the Victorian-ness of the era, she wasn't allowed to befriend men either. Unless, of course, her husband approved of such a relationship, which, it turned out, he did when it came to the Reverend George Dyson. It was a decision that would cost Edwin Bartlett his life. Crimes This Centuries is sponsored by Cremo. I have used and loved Cremo's body wash, but they sent me something new recently that's meant not for my body, but for my boyfriend's. It smells amazing. So Scott, my partner, is one of those daily shower type of guys, which I love. He always smells good. But this bourbon vanilla scent he's been using from Cremo, oh my goodness, it is so yummy. Cremo's men's body wash makes a regular shower feel like a scent sensation. Scott showered with Cremo just a few hours ago. He loves this stuff, says it leaves him feeling clean. He hasn't missed the soap he was used to at all. Cremo works with master perfumers to make sure that every Cremo body wash scent is meticulously blended and refined, and their hard work definitely shows. You can find Cremo men's body wash in its new distinctive bourbon vanilla scent at Walmart or Walmart.com. Once again, that's at Walmart or Walmart.com. George Dyson was a probationary minister at the church Edwin and Adelaide Bartlett attended when their paths crossed in 1885. Dyson was 27 years old and spent a good deal of his time and energy focused on higher learning. While he ministered, he studied for a Bachelor of Arts degree. Edwin liked this about him. After a few informal chats, he suggested that Dyson swing by the Bartletts' home more often to serve as a sort of tutor for Adelaide. The invitation was for him to supervise Adelaide's studies and give her lessons in Latin, history, geography, and mathematics. Since leaving the convent, Adelaide had studied on her own, leading her to some controversial feminist, for the time, readings that had the audacity of suggesting women's physical and emotional health, actually mattered. This was groundbreaking stuff at the time. Two big names in the fledgling field were Dr. Mary Gove Nichols and her husband, Dr. Thomas Lowe Nichols. They wrote books about husbands' misuse of their conjugal rights and the misery of loveless marriages for women. They even talked about the use of contraceptive devices. Condoms at the time were referred to as French letters. How's that for a today I learned? And they suggested carefully that in rare instances, abortions might be justified. As author Kate Clark wrote, quote, "In the 1870s, such literature was certainly regarded as subversive for a young housewife like Adelaide, but with so many uninterrupted hours in which to read, she soon graduated from the devotional texts of her convent days to the preachings of these enlightened, free-thinking sexologists from the New World. Feeling trapped and frustrated in the flat above the shop, alone for most of the day, and probably seeing herself as a prisoner of a loveless marriage, Adelaide read every word and experienced the first flutterings of liberation." End quote. One of the Nichols' most influential books had this as a title: Esoteric Anthropology, The Mysteries of Man, a comprehensive and confidential treatise on the structure, functions, passional attractions, and perversions, true and false physical and social conditions, and the most intimate relations of men and women. It's catchy, no? Adelaide would later say these books espouse something she wholeheartedly believed: that sex within a marriage was for procreation purposes only, and since she and Edwin didn't want to have children anymore, they had no use for sex, period. In fact, she would say, they only had sex the one time. Otherwise, they were a loving but entirely platonic couple. The same could not be said for Adelaide's relationship with the Reverend Dyson.
The relationship between the 27-year-old Reverend and Mrs. Bartlett was somewhat strange and appeared to be more intimate than one of a person merely employed to assist her with her studies.
Once, a servant walked in on them in a compromising position. Sometimes Edwin would be nearby. But whatever was happening between his wife and the Reverend, it didn't seem to bother him in the slightest. By 1885, the Bartletts moved yet again, this time to the Pimlico neighborhood, and Edwin paid travel fare to ensure Dyson could continue visiting as much as he liked.
Reverend Dyson also visited the couple when they were on vacation in Dover, and Mr. Bartlett undertook to pay all the expenses he incurred.
The relationship moved fast on all fronts. That's evidenced most clearly by the changing of Edwin's will. Edwin's original will left everything to his wife with one condition: she wasn't allowed to remarry ever. Clark wrote that the clause might have actually come from the agents who represented Adelaide's father when Edwin agreed to marry her back in 1875, the thinking being that the clause would protect Adelaide from some creepy suitor who might remarry her just to steal her money. However, that clause would become unnecessary in 1882 with the passing of the Married Women's Property Act, which gave women the right to retain their assets even if they remarried. Adelaide didn't need the protection anymore, and she didn't like having the limitation still hanging over her head via Edwin's will. And she was blunt about this. She once complained about it to the nurse Annie Walker, with Edwin close enough to hear. By the time Edwin changed the will in September of 1885, His wife had been sleeping with the Reverend Dyson for months. We can't know for sure if Edwin was totally clear on what was happening, but based on later trial testimony, it seems likely he was. When he changed the will, Edwin not only had 2 witnesses sign his amended will to give Adelaide everything no matter her subsequent marital status, but he also named Dyson the executor of his estate. He wrote letters to Dyson praising him for his tutoring of Adelaide and proclaiming that he loved him like a brother. Most days, Dyson and Adelaide spent time together, sometimes from 11 a.m. until past dinner time. Edwin was rarely around, as he left for work around 8 a.m. and didn't get home until after dinner himself. The servants at the Bartlett's flat were scandalized. Adelaide talked to Dyson about everything, her thoughts on spirituality, women's rights, intimacy, sex, everything. She told him about how she'd learned a lot about pharmaceuticals, their uses, and even their dosages. She was able to put that know-how to use a few years earlier, she said, when Edwin had gotten very sick and she helped treat him. When he was later asked, Dyson couldn't remember what disease Adelaide had said her husband endured, but he remembered she referred to a growth that still caused him bouts of pain. What's more, she told Dyson, she had consulted Dr. Mary Nichols, the one who co-wrote the book with the absurdly long title, about Edwin's symptoms, and Nichols said Edwin would probably die within a year. Mark John McGuire again.
Although Edwin showed no signs of illness, George Dyson apparently did not query this.
In fairness, it wouldn't have been proper to ask about such personal matters in this era, so maybe that's why Dyson kept mum. Though, on the other hand, he was a minister, basically in a love triangle, so you'd think that normal boundaries might be less firm than usual. Whatever the case, within a few months, it began to seem that Adelaide and Dr. Nichols' prognosis had been right all along. Suddenly, Edwin felt very, very ill. It seemed the end was near. Crimes This Centuries is sponsored by Wild Grain. I am on a seemingly never-ending quest to figure out the easiest, healthiest, and most delicious way to make meals, and Wild Grain definitely helps. It's so easy and delicious, and I promise you, if things aren't easy and delicious, I'm not going to keep doing it. Wild Grain is the first ever baked from frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, fresh pastas, and artisanal pastries. Every item bakes from frozen in 25 minutes or less, no thawing required. Your Wild Grain box is fully customizable, so you can choose any combination of breads, pastas, and pastries you want. Wild Grain just launched a brand new plant-based box featuring a wide selection of plant-based pastries, breads, and hand-cut pastas. I can't wait to try this. For a limited time, you can get $30 off the first box, plus free croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC to start your subscription. You heard me, free croissants in every box and $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC. That's wildgrain.com/COTC, or you can use promo code COTC at checkout. In October 1885, Edwin Bartlett began to experience a sort of general malaise. He seemed run down both physically and mentally. At first, it could have been dismissed as exhaustion, but soon his symptoms took a turn. He started producing far more saliva than was typical and complained of a metallic taste in his mouth. And perhaps more troubling, his limbs began to twitch uncontrollably. As Kate Clark described in her book, quote, "The most distressing symptom of all was the swollen and spongy state of his gums," end quote. I don't know about you, but spongy is an adjective I never want associated with my gums. Yikes. Edwin was terrified of dentists, so he did everything he could to self-treat at home, which included using an oral antiseptic available at the time called Condy's fluid. I found ads for the product in 19th century newspapers, and this was wild stuff. It was an antiseptic and a disinfectant that claimed to do all sorts of stuff that had nothing to do with oral hygiene. It destroyed bad smells and purified closets and drains. It sweetened the house and freshened the air. It purified water and cleaned cisterns. It even prevented cholera. Unfortunately, the mouthwash/floor cleaner didn't help Edwin at all. The odor that emanated from his mouth was repulsive, like sewage. His limb twitching kept him from sleeping well at night, and suddenly he became very sensitive to sunlight. At first, neither Edwin nor Adelaide told anyone about the symptoms. Edwin seemed to think they would subside any day, as though it were a mere cold he had to shake. Despite Edwin's optimism, Adelaide told the Reverend George Dyson that her husband's days were numbered. Come November, Edwin's symptoms weren't simply lingering, but they were morphing. He suffered awful bouts of diarrhea and vomiting that sapped his energy. After one particularly bad day for Edwin that included intense stomach pains, Adelaide finally sought out medical help and found Dr. Alfred Leach, a new physician close to the flat. Leach was inexperienced but book-smart, and he was also pliable. When Adelaide said her husband could be a smidgen hypochondriacal at times, Leach obediently looked for psychological causes to his patient's ailments. In his first set of notes, the doctor wrote that Edwin generally appeared healthy, looking more like a 30-year-old than the 40 he really was. He seemed fit and muscular, yet also timid and shaky at the same time. Strangely, when Edwin was asked about his symptoms, he often didn't answer, instead deferring to Adelaide to respond for him. At first, Leach diagnosed Edwin with acute gastritis and prescribed some medicine to soothe his stomach. Something had caught his eye in the examination of Edwin, though, so when he returned to his office, he checked his literature. There had been a blue line running along the patient's gums. Per Leach's books, that could point to mercury poison, as could the excessive saliva Edwin had been experiencing. Now, mercury was sometimes taken at the time to treat syphilis, so Leach confronted Edwin. "Are you taking mercury to treat this STI you don't want your wife to know about?" Edwin said, "No way, that's ridiculous." But then he did acknowledge taking a random blue pill he'd found in a drawer at his office, which is amazing. I mean, who wouldn't spot a random blue pill in a desk and pop it in their mouth? Leach decided that blue pill must have been mercury, and so that diagnosis shaped the rest of his treatments. Sometimes it would seem Edwin was rebounding, but each time the respite was brief. All the while, Adelaide waited hand and foot on her husband. Leach would later testify that she was a devoted wife who, if anything, was a bit overbearing and overprotective of her husband. This is when she started limiting how many visits Edwin could have from friends and family, a move that upset Father Bartlett most of all. She was less restrictive when it came to the Reverend George Dyson, who visited pretty often. During one visit, on December 27th, Adelaide took Dyson aside and said she needed his help. From They Got Away with Murder again.
Adelaide told George that her husband occasionally became delirious, and the only remedy for this was chloroform. She asked him to procure it for her.
She explained that she'd been giving Edwin chloroform for years to treat bouts like this, but nurse Annie Walker had been providing her with the medication, and now Annie had moved to America, leaving Adelaide high and dry. She didn't want to ask Edwin's new doctor for it because he wouldn't be very discreet and would probably be stingy with the dosing. And anyway, she knew a lot more about dosing for Edwin than any newcomer doctor would. She'd been doing it for years, after all. George agreed. He'd figure out a way to get her chloroform.
George realized it would be problematic to procure a large quantity of chloroform, so he decided to write to a friend, a medical student in Bristol, to acquire it for him. When he met Adelaide next day, he informed her of this. She was furious at the delay it implied and sent him off to purchase it himself at once.
So, to make Adelaide happy while also not freaking anyone out by asking for a huge amount of chloroform from any one source, George spread out his request. First, he got a 1-ounce bottle from a chemist on Upper Richmond Street.
And when asked by the chemist what he required this for, he said it was to remove grease stains from a jacket. He then went to another chemist in Wimbledon and requested chloroform for cleaning purposes, receiving 2 ounces in 2 separate bottles, and then went to a third chemist and purchased 2 more ounces on the same pretext. The chemist here suggested ammonia or turpentine would be better, but Dyson told him he preferred chloroform.
Dyson took those bottles of chloroform and combined them into a single bottle, then tossed the individual bottles away. Next, he dutifully delivered the 5 ounces of chloroform to a happy Adelaide. 4 days later, Edwin Bartlett was dead. Dyson was bereaved straight away, but the worry took a little longer to set in. At first, Dr. Leach insisted that Edwin must have died from mercury poisoning, even when a more experienced doctor insisted that the blue line around Edwin's gums was actually associated with lead, not mercury. Leach was like, "Nah, I got this. I'm sure I'm right." When he finally let go of that theory, he shifted to insisting that Edwin must have died from chlorodyne poisoning. That theory was formed because a bottle of chlorodyne was found in Edwin's room. It had been prescribed as a mouthwash, but if ingested, if Edwin had accidentally swallowed it, it could have been fatal. Adelaide insisted that no, it wasn't possible Edwin swallowed that medicine. She said she herself had watched him use it and he'd only rubbed his gums with it. Leach shifted again. He asked Adelaide if it was at all possible that Edwin had gotten his hands on some kind of poison. In a reply that would come back to haunt her, Adelaide said, quote, "No, he could have no poison without my knowing it," end quote. Adelaide was eager to have an autopsy conducted on Edwin, though the results did not do her any favors. As soon as doctors opened Edwin's chest cavity, they were overwhelmed by the unmistakable odor of chloroform. Testing substantiated that find, and that's when George Dyson cracked. He went to the police and told them about his and Adelaide's relationship, though he emphasized that Edwin was not only in the know about it, but he absolutely encouraged it. Once, in fact, the Reverend said he worried he was growing too attached to Adelaide, and he told Edwin maybe he shouldn't see her anymore. Edwin insisted otherwise, telling Dyson that he'd made him the executor of his will and that he expected Dyson to take care of his wife were anything to ever happen to him. Dyson knew he had already ruined his clerical career by stepping forward. Soon, he realized he might have ended his life altogether. He and Adelaide were both arrested and charged with murder.
The trial of Adelaide Bartlett and George Dyson began on the 12th of April, 1886, at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Wills. The Attorney General, Sir Charles Russell, led for the prosecution, and the defense was led by Edward Clark, QC.
Now, Edward Clark was an interesting lawyer for Adelaide to land because he was one of the most famous in the country. Even more interesting was word that Adelaide's biological father was footing Clark's bill. As soon as the trial got underway, Dyson caught a break. Charges against him were dismissed by prosecutors who said they didn't have sufficient evidence against him. Their obvious goal was to ensure he would testify against his former lover. The two reportedly never looked at each other again. Any semblance of fondness they'd had toward each other had evaporated as cleanly as a droplet of chloroform. A parade of witnesses testified against Adelaide. Father Bartlett, for one, who was sure his daughter-in-law had intentionally killed his son. Neighbors who always found Adelaide a little standoffish. George Dyson, who spilled all, plus the various merchants from whom he'd bought the chloroform. No one testified on Adelaide's behalf. Annie Walker, the longtime friend and nurse, said Adelaide and Edwin seemed to have a loving relationship, but she also said that despite what Adelaide had told Dyson, She had never helped procure chloroform for Edwin. That had been a lie. Dr. Leach said Adelaide was attentive as she took care of Edwin and seemed a doting wife, but he also said that Adelaide told him her relationship with her husband had been purely platonic outside of the one time they'd had sex to procreate. After that baby died, they never slept together again, she said, and, in fact, she actually used chloroform of late to make him drowsy because he'd started feeling frisky and she didn't want to cheat on Dyson. But then Nurse Annie poked a hole in that story by saying that she knew Adelaide and Edwin had sex using French letters, aka condoms. That testimony suggested Adelaide was a straight-up liar. Juries don't usually like liars. Another thing Adelaide apparently lied about, she talked about the bottle of chloroform that Dyson had given her. If Edwin hadn't consumed it, it should have still been in their flat. But instead, it was missing. And she said that that was because during a train ride one day, she dumped it into a lake. She was very descriptive about this, describing the water and how it absorbed the liquid. But there was a problem with that. The lake that day had been frozen solid, and the bottle that she supposedly tossed out her window was never found. Prosecutors overall had made a pretty strong case for Meriticide outside of one key issue. See, chloroform, when ingested, irritates all it touches. If you swallow it, it should irritate the inside of your mouth, or, if you drink quickly enough to bypass that, your trachea. And that's assuming you don't vomit it up straight away. If Edwin had vomited, investigators wouldn't have known because Adelaide cleaned his sheets and his clothing straight away. But according to the autopsy, he also didn't have internal injuries. If he had drunk the poison pure, it would have gone down like fire. It was possible it had been diluted with, say, brandy that was found in a glass in the room, but the glass had been cleaned too quickly for testing, so there was no proof. And anyway, that might have disguised it enough for Edwin to swallow, but it still should have left some telltale signs in his mouth or throat. Maybe she had used a bit of chloroform on a cloth to knock him out, which might have meant he wouldn't struggle with the burning liquid in his throat, but people don't tend to easily swallow when unconscious. Some of that stuff would have leaked out his mouth, irritating the skin on his face. Someone suggested maybe Adelaide had put a hose down Edwin's throat and administered the chloroform that way, but then how would she have managed that? She had been a caregiver before, but intubating someone is a bit more involved. Finally, Adelaide's defense lawyers said, hey, maybe Edwin took the drug intentionally. If he had steeled himself to drink it, he could have maybe done it quickly, leaving minimal markings. Working against that theory, though, was the seemingly great day Edwin had had on New Year's Eve 1885. He was making plans for a work trip, he'd ordered a breakfast for the next morning, he told his father about plans he had for him for the upcoming year. The circumstantial evidence against Adelaide was damning, but the jury just couldn't fit all the pieces together in a way that felt beyond a reasonable doubt. So, she was acquitted.
There was a roar of approval from the gallery. Edward Clark was prostrate with exhaustion, tearful, so great was his personal investment in the case.
It's hard to say why it happened, but Adelaide had somehow become a sympathetic character as the case against her unfolded. It's surprising, really, when you consider that she'd had an extramarital lover in Victorian times, that lover had been a minister, of all things, that she was an immigrant in an era when foreigners were side-eyed, that she'd held progressive views on women's roles in marriage and education. She could have been demonized, but she largely wasn't, not even by people who assumed that she'd done the deed, even if they agreed that prosecutors had failed to prove it. Take surgeon and pathologist Sir James Paget, who, after the acquittal, mused, quote, "Now that it is all over, I believe Mrs. Bartlett should tell us, in the interests of medical science, just how she did it," end quote. The mystery that surrounded the case endured. In 1953, Alfred Hitchcock wrote a news story called The Chloroform Clue, My Favorite Mystery, in which he declared the Pimlico poisoning, quote, one of the strangest stories I ever encountered, end quote. For her part, Adelaide never did step forward to offer any clarity. In fact, she became a mystery herself. After her acquittal, she was never again in the public eye, and it seems she changed her name, for there's no death record of anyone called Adelaide Bartlett, born near 1855. To research this story, I read In the Interests of Science, Adelaide Bartlett and the Pimlico Poisoning by Kate Clark, as well as contemporary news coverage. I also dug into ancestry reports and watched some YouTube documentaries I worked to fact-check. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/GrabBagCollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Schoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.